Hi, this is Paul. Jordan Peterson dropped a three-way conversation with Steven Pinker and Jonathan Haidt, and the second half of this is just with Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if I'll treat the section with Steven Pinker. There's some interesting things in there, but I thought the most interesting part of that video that he dropped just a day or two ago was his conversation with Jonathan Haidt. Now, I was a fan of Jonathan Haidt before I ever heard of Jordan Peterson. I had read which of his, I think The Righteous Mind was the first book that I read. I liked it so much. I wondered if he had written anything else. And then I found The Happiness Hypothesis, which is actually my favorite book of his. And so I've really appreciated the work of Jonathan Haidt for quite a while. And the first conversation that Jordan Peterson had with Jonathan Haidt I thought was okay. But in this one, I think they really start to get into some deeper things. Now, Jonathan Haidt, of course, talks about morality binding and blinding. Status binds and blinds. And Jonathan Haidt hasn't put out as much work publicly as Jordan. And so I think Jordan is a little bit better up to speed with Jonathan's work than Jonathan is with Jordan's work. And that shows in this conversation. But I thought this was an outstanding conversation, hopefully for a bunch of reasons that I can illuminate as I make some comments through it. But I was really excited about this conversation, and it did not disappoint.
So let's start by talking a little bit more about The Righteous Mind.
Okay.
And I'd like to know more about your conceptualization of, conceptualization of religious instinct, religious impulse, something like that. So like, how do you view that, and why is it that you've been asked to talk to gatherings of religious people, for example?
Yeah.
Now, before I let him talk, I want to bring up Adam Friended a little bit, because Adam has been a conversation partner in this stuff for me for quite a while. He used to have a pretty successful clip channel on YouTube of Jordan's stuff, and then, of course, now he has these monumental Sunday live streams with PSA Sitch. But I'll bring in a little Twitter here. So I posted on Twitter, there's some real gold in this conversation between Jordan Peterson and John Haidt and Steven Pinker. I hope I can find time to mine it. And Adam responded, Haidt is not taking any of that metaphysics, laugh out loud. We should really watch some videos together. I can give the materialist perspective on Peterson. I think the religious side is missing. These two camps should be better acquainted. I think that's true. But his first line, I thought, was exactly right in terms of Haidt in this conversation. And I hope I can, as we go through it, probably shed some light on maybe what Jordan is doing and perhaps what Jonathan is doing.
So the story that I tell in The Righteous Mind is that humans are products of multi-level selection, which means that for the most part, if you read Richard Dawkins, for the most part, it's selfish genes create their survival machines, animals or plants, and those survival machines compete with other survival machines, and that's what we all know, sort of textbook Darwinian evolution. But while I love Dawkins' writing, I love The Selfish Gene, he for some reason says that plants and animals are the vehicles that the selfish genes travel on, but groups are not. He just says groups.
Individual plants and animals and
can't be, he just rules vehicles that the selfish genes travel on, but groups are not. He just says groups can't be, he just rules that out, if I remember correctly. And for most species, that works great. But for bees, for example, it obviously doesn't work. For bees, it's obvious that the unit isn't the individual bee, it's the hive where the queen is the ovary. And the argument that I make in The Righteous Mind is that humans show signs of some group level selection. That is, we're primates, we're like chimpanzees and bonobos in a lot of ways, but we have this ability to lose ourselves in something larger, to become completely unselfish, to sacrifice for the group. That is unlike any other animal that is not genetically 50% or more shared genes with all the other animals in its group. And
now, what he just said right there, I wish he would play that back and listen to his own words, because what he just said asks the question, what is that? So What is a group? We tend to think, as he's complaining about Dawkins, in individualist terms, and that a human being is something wrapped in skin. But a group of human beings acts in a different way. And this is exactly what Peterson is going to pounce on and really push him at. Because what happens when people act as groups? Now, it changes their genetics. In other words, there's something out there which is not physical. It's relational. You might say it's informational, but it's not physical. And how do you attest, account, label, track that in your system? Now, again, from below, you might call that emergent, but there has to be a way to account for the ontology of, just at this point, even the groupness in your system. And I'm not a philosopher. Non-reductive physicalism, which is, of course, how John Vervaeke addresses it. This is many ways kind of the area that we're talking about, the ontology, let's say, of this groupness. So if you talk about human beings or Homo sapien, that is a group. Now, where is that group? Well, is it in all the people? Is it between all the people? Is it among all the people? And what is that thing when you can find lots of Homo sapiens around, but there is not one, or maybe there is, essential Homo sapien of which all the others are participating, or defects of, or corruptions of, or in other words, you can find lots of human beings, but show me the perfect human being or the ideal human being, because this is sort of where Jordan Peterson is going to go with this. So let's back it up.
And we're like chimpanzees and bonobos in a lot of ways. The queen is the ovary. And says groups can't be, he just rules that out, if I remember correctly, that plants and animals are the vehicles that the selfish genes travel on. But
okay, so you've got the genes, and the genes, of course, are chemical. And then these genes create, we're sort of the servants of the genes, and we're the vehicles of the genes by which the genes are going to travel through time. Now, you can ask yourself also whether the gene is actually this little string of, what are they, amino acids? This little string, or is it in fact, we categorize it into four letters. Is it in fact those four letters? Because those four letters, what's a letter? Everything starts to get wild. So again, let's listen to him again.
Groups are not. He just says groups can't be. He just rules that out, if I remember correctly. And for most species, that works great. But for bees, for example, it obviously doesn't work. For bees, it's obvious that the unit isn't the individual bee. It's the hive where the queen is the ovary. And the argument that I make in The Righteous Mind is that humans show signs of some group level selection. That is, we're primates. We're like chimpanzees and bonobos in a lot of ways, but we have this ability to lose ourselves in something larger,
to lose ourselves in something larger. What do you mean by that? Now, again, we all sort of know what he means by that, but account for it with your system. It's not a physical thing. Well, there might be physical things that are accompanying it, but we lose ourselves in something larger. We do all the time, and we know that.
Completely unselfish, to sacrifice for the group that is unlike any other animal that is not genetically 50% or more shared genes with all the other animals in its group. And so drawing on research on early human origins, and especially the period around from like 1 million years ago to 200,000 years ago, it appears that we did live in groups that competed with other groups for territory over all sorts of things, and that often wiped out or killed other groups.
Now, I was another thing on the internet I want to do something on is, in fact, The Rest is History's episode on dinosaurs. That gets into exactly the same thing. Now listen to the way he talks, and it will not strike you as strange in any way.
Groups, million human origins, and especially the period around, from like 1 million years ago.
Okay, 1 million years ago.
To 200,000 years ago.
To 200,000 years ago.
So it appears that we did.
It appears that we. How is that us? What can you point to? Well, you might point to a legacy of genetic what? Duplication. And the creation of carriers of this genetic code through time. But notice the identity. We. Where is that we? Well, this is an imaginative construct. Well, how powerful is it? Well, according to everyone in this conversation, it's enormously powerful because it's governing all sorts of things that are happening around us. We, 1 million years ago to 250,000 years ago. You might see my gray beard. I'm not that old.
Live in groups that competed with other groups for territory, over all sorts of things, and that often wiped out or killed other groups. And so I think there was some degree of group level selection. We are everyone here on Earth now our genes are not a cross section of the genes that were on this Earth 100,000 or 200,000 years ago. Most groups left no trace, and other groups went on to spectacular success. So the way you see this is not.
So, I mean, think about that. Most groups left no trace. History is quite literally written by the winners because that's the only one left who can do any writing. But here we were back there. And again, we talk this way all the time, think nothing of it, and we know what we're saying. But if you pause it and slow it down and think, well, that's a strange thing to talk. I guess we are all genocidal maniacs killing our competitors, and we have written history of the winners, even though we don't recognize it, do we?
By having an argument about altruism, which is where the argument is usually done, Steve Pinker and I Steve disagrees with me on this. Steve doesn't think that group selection played any role. But I think if you look at groupishness or tribalism, why are we so tribal? Why do we love to paint our faces and band together and drink together and do all this stuff for sports?
Okay. So why do we like to... Sports is going to be a big part of this conversation. Why do we like to paint our faces and get together? Why do we... Now let's ask ourselves, what's the difference between why do we do it and why do we like to? That's going to be important as this rolls out. So why do we do this? Why do we like to? And the assumption here is, of course, that, well, the reasons for it are back in our genetic ancestry and our coding, and we have learned to do this. Genocidal robots, I don't know, that's Brett Weinstein's term, but we do this. Why do we like doing it? So the why of this, well, there's a reason. The reason is because our ancestors did it and they lived, so therefore we do it. So what's with all this cognitive stuff? Now, of course, Jonathan Haidt say, well, that's the chattering rider on top of the elephant, but the elephant is going about its business, going to sports games, painting themselves up, doing this, doing that.
Why do we have these tribal responses? And I talk about my response on 9/11, on September 11th. I had this deep urge to display an American flag. Like, where did that come from? It was almost like a Jungian.
I wanted to go to war. flag, nothing. I could show me I was too old to sign up. I had family, but it's like, yeah, bomb them into the Stone Age. You know, where's that coming from? And again, at the 9/11 retrospective, you know, I was watching the film and had exactly the same reaction. Where does this come from? What is this reaction? Who is we? I guess it's the inner genocidal killer in me that wanted to destroy the people who destroyed these symbols that I inherited growing up, seeing them built, seeing them rise, going to the top, looking over the world. This was, of course, something that my father enjoyed doing, and we would do with my father, yada, 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 yada.
Sort of like thing welling up urge. And I talk about my response on 9/11, on September 11th. I had this deep urge to display an American flag. Like, where did that come from? It was almost like a Jungian sort of like thing welling up from my collective unconscious. It was weird, but I had a real...
It was weird. Why was it weird? I mean, it shouldn't be thought of as weird at all, because by everything that we've been talking about in this conversation, it should be completely expected. But now we are even weirder creatures. That means that someone can attack us and we wouldn't be groupish at all. We would be detached and, I guess, modernity on steroids.
Urge to display an American flag, but as a professor, I couldn't really do that because people would think I was a Republican. And
that would be horrible.
It's the solution I came up with.
Well, it's one way of marking yourself as not a terrorist.
Not a terrorist.
And, I often see moments in this where I don't think Haidt understands Peterson. And I think in this case, I think Peterson better understands Haidt, and he's really addressing things. So why would a flag? Well, you're not a terrorist. I mean, I just finished a conversation with Dave, who's one of the members of the German estuary, and he asked when the Christian Reformed Church gave up the Dutch language in America, and it was during World War I. And you can find flags all over Christian Reformed churches during World War I, because one particular church was burned to the ground by its neighbors who couldn't distinguish Deutsch from Dutch. And so all of these people that looked like me coming together, speaking this strange language, worshiping, well, they've certainly got to be dangerous. They must be Germans. No, we're not German. We're Dutch, I swear. Doesn't matter. Still going to burn your church down unless you cover it with flags and show that you're an American and not the Hun.
Terrorist is to one way because people would think I was a Republican. So I
guess Republican is worse than a terrorist.
It's the solution I came up with.
Well, it's one way of marking yourself as not a terrorist.
That's a really good point.
Not a terrorist is to what?
And Haidt doesn't get it. I found that moment quite interesting.
Fly a flag. I mean, if you imagine that your group is attacked, the first thing that's relevant is who's with you and who isn't. And I mean, that was made public politically by Bush, right?
Watch all the documentaries. Bush got on the phone and said, either you're with us or you're not, or you're against us. And guess what? Most of the world said, with you. Coalition of the more or less willing.
Right? If you're not with us, you're against us. And so that might be part of an atavistic attempt to say, look, guys, I'm definitely on your side. I'm not trying to put it down.
Yeah. Well, okay. But but you're suggesting an individually adaptive reason for flying a flag, but you wouldn't need that if we didn't have the groupish tribal thing of let's kill people who aren't going along with us. So anyway, to bring this back to religion, my point is that we evolved in this dynamics of group versus group. And here I follow David Sloan Wilson, in saying...
Yeah, and I remember him. I did some videos a long time ago. He has some very interesting stuff.
Conflict within conflict at any level brings about cooperation at the next level down. And so we come together to compete. We cooperate intensely in order to compete with.
And that's again one of Jonathan Haidt's things. We cooperate in order to compete
with other groups. And that would be a hallmark of a long period of intergroup competition, which shaped which genes have come down to us today.
Now, that's a hallmark of this. Now, I just did a video on Cosmic Skeptic and another one a little while before on Rationality Rules. And of course, you sit here and talk about evolution, it'll be yes, 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 yes. If you understand what Jonathan Haidt is saying, he's saying that it's pretty much automatic that we're going to act this way. This isn't rationality, this is instinct. Okay? This is instinct. Now, got to keep in mind, again, C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, The problem with instinct is that there's so many of them. And we don't want to dispel rationality completely. That's sort of where Sam Harris goes. But so there's instinct. And so Jonathan Haidt felt welling up within him a desire to put up a flag, but maybe out of fear of being labeled a Republican, he suppressed it. I felt up within me a desire to join the army and get a gun and blow up something or kill something, and I suppressed that within me because, well, there's a lot going on with that, and, I'm a Christian after all, and I did have, 5 little kids at the house. Let's see, 2001, yeah, I had 5 then. 5 little kids at the house and a wife, and I was a little old for the army, and so I didn't sign up, but boy, that's what's welling up within me, and then, hit rationality, and we had our own little conflict.
So anyway, we didn't evolve for big gods. We didn't evolve for,
We didn't evolve for big gods. And when I first heard that, what does he mean? Well, he's going to keep going.
For, Yahweh and Allah. We evolved for, little gods and sprites and the god of this river and this tree. And
we evolved for, well, pre-Weber, an enchanted world. This reminded me of this piece that Nate Heil had sent me, Grail Country, over in the comments section. This individual is talking about living in a Cambodian village and how law basically goes all the way back to these little gods that Haidt is talking about. First, let's visit a non-Western society that I am passively familiar with, the average Khmer village out in Cambodian countryside. 4 authorities have claim on the Khmer daily conduct. The first, that which we're most familiar in Western readers, the Cambodian government, but its hand is weak. Many times over the last few centuries, such as the crisis of 1830s and 40s, its authority disappeared altogether. The next source is the one most embodied in living, breathing individuals, the Buddhist Sangha and its precepts. These two are at times intertwined. I find it interesting that when the Cambodian government officers wish to explain new laws to Khmer villages, they do so with analogy to the Buddhist code of ethics. In a country like Cambodia, the concept of religious law precedes its secular counterpart. Both government regulations and the Buddhist Dhamma are more honored in the breach than in the observance. The actual force of Cambodian life is tradition, epitomized in Khmer proverbs and in the didactic poems such as the Chabab. On the one hand, the dictates of the Nikta and the other spirits that occupy the Cambodian countryside on another. Hannah Arendt concedes the importance of tradition in making proper law abides of otherwise unruly men, though Cambodians take principle to an extreme which would surprise her. I've always found it interesting that the word chabab is used somewhat indiscriminately. You will hear it to describe didactic poem, a societal code, a government command. Once again, we see government authority being piggybacked on older, less political conceptions of authority. This makes sense a little bit later. The most important of the beings are the Nikta, or the grandfathers. The Nikta are territorially bound, described by Khmer as the masters of the water and the earth. Every village in Cambodia has one. This is one. Khmer I would have talked to are not consistent on this point. Usually the spirits will choose to reside in an object convenient for venerations, rocks, body, trees, statues, made especially to hold the Nikta's presence. The Nikta must be respected. When his will is known, it must be obeyed. If one is to clear farmland or hunt a forest, then the Nikta's permission must be granted. To defy Nikta is to court disaster. Those who do not please the Nikta will be punished with injury, illness, and failing crops. Those who gain its favor, on the other hand, will be blessed with good weather, bumper crops, healthy pregnancies, lucky lottery tickets, and the return of lost water buffalo. The state may not have the power to regulate impersonal behavior, but the Nikta certainly do. Pick one example. Some of the Nikta frown on infidelity. If one member of a household is sick, the time has come to find out if any other member of the household has been unfaithful. To placate the Nikta, the offender must admit their crime publicly and make penance with the anger with the angered master of water and earth, usually through offering. I'm not aware of any anthropological or sociological study that has measured the total amount the average Khmer family offers to the Nikta per year, but it is not small. The Nikta of forests might be given alcohol poured on the ground before the villagers begin hunting trips or patrol to keep out illegal loggers. The Nikta of a village might be given an offering before the fields are planted and a new child is born. At least once a year, the entire village will gather together for a feast to honor the Nikta. Villagers will also come together to build a proper house for the Nikta or hire a sculptor who can better represent him. So that's what he means there.
And we evolved to worship our ancestors, and we evolved just this really intense.
And that piece talks about, are they really ancestors? Anyway.
Spirituality that manifests in a magical world. We have all of these beliefs that don't track reality, but they do serve a Durkheimian function. That.
Did you hear what he said right there? They don't track reality. Well, there might be some argument you'd have with the Khmer about that. And you would say, well, you're a Christian minister. You don't believe in the Nikta. No, but it's sort of like the people in the Boxer tsunami example who have spirits that believe about the waters. You say, well, they don't track reality because the waters are moved by tectonic plates, not by the spirits in the water. Yet the people of that religion survived the tsunami better than the people who believed in science. Why is that? So who's tracking reality? And what do we mean by tracking reality? One of the interesting things about this conversation is if you can go back and very early on, Haidt elevates truth. Not so much in this part of the conversation. So, but again, we live in a post-Enlightenment world. Most of us don't believe in the Nikta. But the dismissal that this doesn't track reality, that's sort of where Peterson is going to be a little bit more reticent and say, well, how do we track reality? Do we track reality here and now? And I'll go out and I'll hunt without giving my sacrifice to the Nikta, and we'll see if anything bad happens. That's sort of the business about cutting down the sacred oak and making a church out of it to show the barbarians in northern Gaul exactly which god is reigning. So, there's a lot here, and let's not be quite so dismissive about some of these things.
As they do serve, I believe, not to help us understand the world, but to bond together with others so that we can survive in this world in conflict and competition with other groups.
So in other words, the Nikta don't tell us anything about the world, but the function of the Nikta is to bind the Khmer people together in the little village or whatever place their little Baal or master or Baal or local deity or what have you is reigning over that place, and that binds the group together, and that's the function of the thing. Okay. But, and that function of the thing just doesn't give us a lot of account for that thing. And of course, rationality is nowhere to be seen in any of this because he just sort of dismissed it away. But again, this is exactly where Peterson is going to say, should we be quite so sure, and do we have evidence, or do we have reason to believe that maybe these Khmer aren't quite so irrational as we might imagine them to be? And, again, when I talk about these things, I think about Adam's lines, because Adam doesn't like philosophy, which some philosophy is sort of helpful, some categories with some of these things, but materialist. So there's what does Adam object to, and what is his complaint about some of the Peterson people of dismissiveness towards basically this posture that, well, none of this stuff works. It's just we're just working through the programming that has been built into us. Okay, so then why didn't I join the army? And why did or didn't Jonathan Haidt put up a flag to be confused with a Republican? It's not the only C.S. Lewis's point about instinct in The Abolition of Man. The problem with instincts is that there's so many of them. So on one hand, I had an instinct to not leave my wife and children and try to join the army at, what was I, 30? Not join the army September 11, so I would have been 38. Yeah. Join the army at 38. The army would have said, no. Well, maybe as a chaplain. Well, then I don't get to bomb and kill people if I'm a chaplain. So
that's the Durkheimian story. And in The Righteous Mind, I was so pleased that I could integrate.
Okay, the Durkheimian story. What does he mean by that? Well, he's noting that the function of religion, the adaptive function of religion is that so people can cooperate in order to compete. But it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the world.
Durkheim, we can survive in this world in conflict and competition with other groups. That's the Durkheimian story. And in The Righteous Mind, I was so pleased that I could integrate two of my heroes in the social sciences, which are Durkheim and Darwin. They actually fit together perfectly on the subject of multi-level selection and even on ideas of sacredness and groups coming together. So that's the approach I developed to religion. The Righteous Mind, I originally thought I'd write about politics, but the subtitle is Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion.
Why would you say good people? Because can you? Do we have a category for that in this world? Successful people, perhaps, those who are cooperating in order to compete, but he didn't want to put up a Republican flag. I mean, shouldn't we have cooperated in order to have I don't know, blown Afghanistan back into the Stone Age? Wasn't that sort of what was operating amidst the Bush administration? That's what we're going to do, or maybe a surgical strike, or. And kudos to Jordan for letting Jonathan talk this long. Makes me happy. He's going to interrupt plenty in what's to come, but
because they're largely the same thing psychologically.
So that idea of the sacred, so
that's where we're going to go. The idea of the sacred. The idea of the sacred. Well, sacred would be something that binds us together as groups. That's its function. And certainly the sacred has that capacity, but is that what the sacred is? Is a star really a burning ball of gas?
I mean, we might ask, what are the preconditions for being able to live peacefully with other people?
Mm-hmm. Because, okay, so at least in this, what's the preconditions? How can we live peacefully with other people? Rene Girard just keeps popping up in my consciousness Congress and saying, well, the scapegoat. Yeah, that's there. But we cooperate in order to compete. So, of course, every time the aliens show up in a superhero movie, the whole world comes together. So, let's not take anything away from Durkheim or Haidt here, because they're talking about something that is indeed very true. But the question is that all there is meaningful to say about it?
And it seems to me that, well, if we're all law-abiding, for example, then we all embody the body of the law. And so what...
Now, right when he makes that term, for all law-abiding, well, that's the behavior, we're embodying the body of the law. And then, of course, if you go back to this fun little argument, I mean, things are going to eventually get over down to the law. What's behind all these laws? At least deeply, deeply buried back there in our past.
What that means is that we're imitating something. Mm-hmm. We're all imitating the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes us the same. And that's why I commented earlier in our conversation that maybe what unites people isn't so much belief as the pursuit of something like a shared ideal.
Yeah,
and so,
I'm a little, yeah.
Well, okay, well, let me just develop that a little bit, because you talked about what was sacred. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that there's an association between what's sacred and what inspires awe. Does that seem reasonable?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Okay, do you think it's reasonable to presume that the instinct for awe is the same as the instinct for imitation, for mimicry?
Okay. Now, it's important that he uses the word instinct there, because that's, of course, the level we're coming at. And this is what we're talking about in terms of we've had all of this selection over time, and now this is built into us. When the towers are attacked, I want to go do harm to somebody. And Jonathan Haidt, he's obviously a much nicer person. He just wants to put up a flag. But this is instinct. Okay, this is part of the equation.
I don't think they're the same. No, I don't think they're the same at all.
Okay, what's not the same? Let's go back and hear it so we can pay attention.
Okay, let's for awe
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
between what's sacred and what inspires awe. Does that seem reasonable?
Yes, absolutely.
So what's sacred and inspires awe, he might want to pull back from that a little bit later.
Yes.
Okay, do you think it's reasonable to presume that the instinct for awe is the same as the instinct for imitation?
The instinct for awe, that's the numinous, if we're looking at C.S. Lewis's Beginning of the Problem of Pain. The numinous is the same as the instinct for imitation.
For mimicry?
I don't think they're the same. No, I don't think they're the same at all.
Okay, let's go into that a little bit. So I'll tell you why I think they're the same, and you tell me why you think they're not, if that's okay. Well,
Please, that we can
when
find. That'd be fun.
well, let me give you an example. People can be possessed by a spirit at a football game.
Okay. Let's not be scared by that language, because that's sort of like school spirit, right? And if you've followed my channel a lot, you know I talk about school spirit, because one of the real issues we have here in waning modernity is we have to try to figure out what all this spirit talk means. It never left us completely. It's still out in the air, and we might think it's some vestige like we found in the Khmer village, but there's a spirit that possesses us when we go to a football game. Okay, is that mere instinct? Let's have that question in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the teams are cooperating and competing in the way that you described. So there's a tribal element, but overall they're immersed in cooperation because they're all playing soccer. And then they're competing to hit a target fundamentally, which is the goal of most sports events, is to hit a target. Okay, so the teams organize themselves into hierarchies of talent, etc. Essentially, there's a star. Perhaps the star makes a phenomenal athletic gesture and hits the target. And the entire stadium.
Let's just say Tom Brady, because he's my fantasy football quarterback for this year. I'm a very happy man with Tom Brady. My team isn't doing particularly well, as you know. We'll get the full report on the Freddie and Paul show. Freddie is always asking me, Paul, can you mention the Freddie and Paul show more in your videos so more people will watch the Freddie and Paul show? So I really don't think Freddie's going to listen to this, but I've done my due diligence.
Stands up and spontaneously.
I'm really hoping that the cheerleader goes up and spreads her legs, but that was the Vervaeke video.
Right? And because they're observing something that inspires awe.
Oh, they're observing something that inspires awe. Now, remember, he asked the instinct for awe, the numinous in a sense. Is that the numinous exactly? Well, let's leave it for there. And the instinct for mimicry. Now, why do sports teams sell so many jerseys? Why, when I was 12 or 13 years old, could I talk about Chris Chambliss and Thurman Munson and Mickey Rivers and Greg Nettles and Roy White, and I knew all those players on the Yankees. Just some of you are like, unsubscribe. Mimicry. One of the greatest compliments I get paid every now and then was a member of this church's daughter. Daughter came home once and said, I want to be a minister like Pastor Paul. Or that little boy that I told the story about, are you God? So stuff's going on here. Peterson's barking up a tree for some real reasons. He's been paying attention to people. A little bit later in this conversation, they'll get a little bit more wonky in terms of their research, and that's kind of fun too.
And that awe-inspiring act is to hit the target. And they're all in that stadium celebrating the act of hitting the target. Now, I started to figure this out when I looked into the root of the word sin, because it's hamartia. It means to miss the target.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Yeah.
You don't know that, Jonathan Haidt? Oh, why would he know it? See, here's a problem. Here's a problem. We've got, one of the better books written about religion and instinct, and he doesn't know that little simple fact about religion. And this has been a point that's been made by a lot of people, that perhaps part of why academics are doing so poorly is because they are now increasingly, as each generation goes, less and less religious. Yes, sin is missing the mark. He certainly knows the word sin, but he doesn't know where it comes from. And Peterson can, he can do some good work on these points.
Yeah, wow is right. Wow is right. And so the opposite of that is to hit the target. Okay, so you see in a stadium with that spontaneous manifestation of awe, the possession of the entire stadium often, and it's almost entirely unconscious because they get up on their feet before they think. And it's an act of worship, essentially, for that prowess shown, for that demonstration of how to hit the mark.
Let's bring back in the conversation with Jonathan Pageau, attention. Peterson, of course, continues to remind us that he knew he was hitting the mark when he was on his book tour because a hush would fall over the crowd. He had our attention. And there's something deep about attention and worship. Attention and worship aren't exactly the same. It's really much more attention plus love plus devotion that makes worship.
And that's part of the imitative spirit, I think. It's part of imitating what...
Imitative spirit, imitative instinct. Instincts do feel like spirits, but as we're going to see, spirits are something a little bit higher. Remember upper and lower registers. Heaven, spirit, mind, eternity, earth, flesh, matter. See, now is almost eternity. Decay.
What's competent and heroic.
Okay.
I think it's part of imitating what's competent and heroic.
Okay, so I disagree with that analysis because I'm a Durkheimian. I just, what would Emil Durkheim say about that?
He's got dogma. He's part of a different religious tribe. What would Durkheim say about this? This is so much fun.
Is it that people are so amazed at the skill with which that guy kicked a ball into a net? I don't think so.
Now, are you trying to smuggle in consciousness that oh, I'm amazed, therefore it's a voluntary reaction? No, Peterson is right. It's involuntary. So what would Durkheim say?
Sports events of the kind you describe, that never happens with soccer in the United States. For us, it's more football.
Never happens. Come on. There's soccer fans in the United States. It certainly happens on Little League fields. Just watch those parents of the children. And, of course, the soccer moms and the soccer dads. And so, no, it happens in America, too.
Football. Sports events of the kind you describe, that never happens with soccer in the United States. For us, it's more football and sometimes basketball. But of the kind you described, it's the pleasure. And anybody listening to this can probably think of times when they either sung in a choir or played in a band or played on a sports team. And you have that feeling of really becoming one.
Okay. Now, he's talking about the pleasure. All right. And so certainly the pleasure is motivation that might bring people to the stadium to participate in it. And again, I want to go back to megachurches because this is a big piece of the power of megachurches. If you're singing with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people, I even think about this now. This past week, because the weather was so bad, we were only beyond the people that were at church to make the thing run. There were only 3 other people who got here, which I thought was, small. But then I talked to the church planter who had their first service inside at 9:00 and they had 1. So, but there's a little distinction here because it isn't instinctual to go to the church or the theater or the stadium or to the it's in fact there's a whole network of things that are actually going together. And part of what I thought about when I first watched this morning was the power of our scientific method is to eliminate variables and to come down to very tiny causal reactions. That's also its weakness, because when it comes to human beings, there are multiple inputs going on. So with the family at the soccer stadium, there's lots of layers. That's the love for their children, and they're wearing uniforms, and there's lots of stuff going on there. So certainly Durkheim has making a great point, but I'm not sure that's either or what's happening here between them.
That is, I don't know, times when they either sung in a choir or played in a band or played on a sports team, and you have that feeling of really becoming one. That is a I would say a quasi-mystical or mystical experience. It's a sort of a loss of self.
We'd have to bring in John Vervaeke. It's a psychotechnology.
Merging into something larger.
Okay, you're merging into something larger. We lose ourselves. That's what he said before. We're merging into something larger. And again, is it a thing? Is it a hyper thing? See, that's the words we're using now because we've had 500 years of trying to avoid saying we've become one body, or we've become the body of Christ, or, again, religious language has all kinds of ways of saying this, but in materiality, we're sort of grasping for something. It might be the Raider Nation for the Oakland Raiders, or it might be the fandom for Harry Potter, or it might be we now become ostensibly something. And you see this all the time, and this has great resonance. This is the LGBTQ community. This is the group, the people of color, which is the majority of the human race. This is, whiteness. I mean, it's where are our categories for these things? How real are they? And in fact, how can we establish what is real?
Yes. That's my argument about this higher and lower level, the level of the sacred and the level of the profane. And Durkheim describes those are Durkheimian terms. He uses those terms. We can briefly enter the realm of the sacred. And if you're going to...
Now, this is really key, because if you go back, I wonder if I have the PowerPoint ready. Nuts to the PowerPoint. Remember how I talked about when I was talking about the upper and lower registers? Part of our facsimile is we crowdsource the sacred in some ways. You can, in some ways, make something sacred together in a more powerful way than you can do by yourself. And especially in a secular age, when you're sort of in the iron box of secularism, when you're locked into the now as a buffered self, we'll throw in Charles Taylor's philosophical categories. When we're looking around and we can't navigate by the stars, we navigate by each other. And when we say, so say we all, feels sacred. It gives us a sense of the sacred.
Go see a football game. Would you rather have an excellent view of the game alone in a room with an excellent screen, or maybe...
You mean like when we watch it on TV? Would you rather watch it on TV, or would you rather go down to Golden One Arena and watch the Kings lose there? Sorry, Freddie.
Maybe even just an excellent window? Or would you rather be part of the whole crowd that does the wave? I mean, think about the wave.
No, I agree with you.
People spontaneously figured out how they could become a superorganism.
Yeah, so, no, I'm not.
There's another name. Now we're a superorganism. We're gonna need to have some kind of ontology for all of this stuff, won't we?
Disagreeing at all. Yeah. And I do think there's a collective element of that worship that's exactly in keeping with what you're describing. And it does unite people in the imitation of a spirit in exactly the same way that they're united.
Is it the imitation of a spirit? Or is it the embodiment of a spirit? A couple of years ago, I went to the Cliff Dwellers. over in Colorado, in the southwest corner of Colorado. And I'd always wanted to go and see those cliff dwellings, and you can crawl up there and you crawl up these big ladders, and it's really cool. And they talk a little bit about the culture, and I remember they were talking about how when the priest or whatever person, when they put on the mask, they became the god. And again, you think that, you think, what do we mean by that? Well, when you put on, gosh, trying to think of a Derek Carr. I know football players' names because I play fantasy football. What's my Hunter Renfrew? There we go, Hunter Renfrew. I've got him on my fantasy team. ESPN just say he's a good floor player. Why? And he's the kind of player I like to have in my lineup because he gets 6 to 8 targets a game. He'll grab 5 to 6 of them, kind of like so he's a good guy. So good for bye-week fillers. I'll get 6 to 10 points out of him for sure. He won't carry me to victory like Tom Brady or a bunch of my other more elite players. But you put him in the lineup, I'll get 8 to 10 points. I won't get a goose egg like I got out of Miles Davis this week. I was not happy. Anyway, I distract myself. When you put on the jersey, and I remember when my boys were young, and every now and then we had a member of the church who had season tickets to the Kings, and every now and then he'd throw, they were going away. So what are we going to do with his tickets? Let's give it to the pastor, and he'd take his boy. And so I would take 1 or 2 of my sons to a Kings game, and of course they're just at that age when bought a couple jerseys for my kids, and they, put those jerseys on. And what happens when you put on those jerseys? The spirit. It's a spiritual thing, and it's exactly the right word.
In a concert. Imitation of a spirit in exactly the same way that they're united.
Imitation, because again, we're working on the instinct of imitation.
In a concert.
Or is it participation? See, now, that's part of the limitation of the language of instinct, because instinct, and this sort of pushes on the initial problem that Haidt was talking about of individualism, because instinct can be individual because we sort of think of it as biochemical, but it's participation in Raider Nation or the sixth man, as the Kings like to. Bobby Jackson was the best Kings sixth man back in the day when the Kings were good. Such a brief time.
Or when they're playing in a band. I think those are all manifestations of the same thing. And so I'm not saying that it's only individual by any stretch of the imagination,
Okay.
because there'd be nothing that would unite. See, in the stadium, they're united around that.
Right.
Okay.
They become Raider Nation, or they become the King's sixth man.
So let's focus on imitation here. I guess the reason I disagreed with you is that imitation is such an important human ability for learning. The fact that we, and here I draw from Joe Henry.
Okay, and again, let's not keep learning such a scrubbed thing, because let's talk in a little bit more Christian terms, formation. All of this mapping of this absorbing that you do as a child, and these internal maps that you create that are one way or another are going to become instinctive for how you play out your life. And, example of this I often use is that your parents' relationship is the first map of a relationship. And then, I married my wife, and I wasn't even conscious of it, but the first morning I expected her to get up and make breakfast like my mom did. And my wife rolls over and is like, "You want to eat breakfast? Go out, get up and make it." And, it was completely unconscious. It was, I'd want to say instinctive, but that's not really the right word. It was all from that mapping.
Henrik and others, their approach to cultural evolution, Joe's book, Why Humans Cooperate, and The Weirdest People in the World. And for humans, the nature of the game is not who has the biggest, strongest, or...
Now, it's really funny listening to us talk, because for humans, oh yeah, I'm one of them too.
Biggest teeth. It's who learns the most, who learns the best. And we have all this optimization for learning fast. And imitation is a big part of it.
And again, learning sounds a little abstract. It's figuring things out in the, let's just imagine ourselves as, cavemen. Don't read G.K. Chesterton. And so wielding is really what we're talking about. Wielding the physical things of the world, tools, and then learning to wield each other.
Of that. So we do imitation, but we do selective imitation, and we figure who should I imitate. So that would be a sort of a very sort of a lower level, ubiquitous, crucial human ability that we have, has nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with awe. But then I think we can bring our accounts together by saying, now then we also have this thing about we're able to come together in larger groups to pursue common interests, especially in competition. And as we do that, we use our imitation abilities. We draw on our imitation abilities. And so religious worship.
But he's kind of reversed what he charged Peterson with at first, because the imitation abilities are then instrumental, whereas before we all stand up because that's how our programming is. But now our imitation abilities are a little instrumental. Actually, it's always puzzling me. In Judaism, you daven, you bow, but it's not in sync. So that one is, I think, a little different. But often you sing, you sway in harmony. You do what everyone else does, and so
that's to atone.
The davening is to it.
Peterson brings in his Sunday school lessons here. Atone. I mean, I learned that when I was a kid. What does atonement mean? Because I'm learning the Heidelberg Catechism. At one meant. Oh, little preacher talk, and here we are on YouTube land, and it's a big deal.
At one meant atonement.
Oh, at one meant.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
See what you can learn in Sunday school and share with the smartest people in the world.
Yes. So let's go back to imitation.
Okay.
So, okay. So, look, when a son acts out a father when he's playing house, he doesn't imitate his father, by which I mean you could observe the father walking across the room and making certain motions, and the son by no means precisely duplicates those motions.
Right.
What the son does is observe the father across a wide variety of contexts, extract out the gist, and imitate the gist.
Oh, some relevance realization, spirituality. I love where he goes in this talk with gist, because it's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so you made the claim that what we're imitating is the capacity to learn. But I would modify that and say, no, we're imitating the capacity to explore. And there's a difference there. Well, the difference is that learning is, in some sense, it has the connotation of a kind of passivity. Whereas, did you ever see that medieval drawing of the sky all covered with stars and the man on the edge of the earth with his head poking through the firmament? Does that ring a bell?
No.
I think if you showed it to him, he'd say, "Oh yeah, I've seen that 100 times."
An actual medieval drawing or a modern cartoon?
Yeah. No, it's a medieval drawing.
Is it medieval or is it early modern? This is what he's talking about. This very famous picture, and I don't think it's as old. Nicolas Camille Flammarion, 1842 to 1925. See, the reason I don't think this is this is from an engraving of his, 1888, is I didn't think it was old because you don't conceptualize this until you're beyond it. You're not living, I don't mean naively, pejoratively, you're not living unknowingly within it. So 1888 sounds about exactly right. We're reaching, we're within a few decades of peak modernity, and that produces this art. In a sense, it's looking back at the medieval world with a degree of romanticism. Anyway, back to the talk.
Doesn't matter, but it's to boldly go where no one has gone before.
Yeah.
In the modern parlance. Well, there's a narrative that drives that, and that's the thing that's imitated. And I think all of those collective manifestations of immersement in the sacred that you're describing are opportunities for people to collectively engage in attention to and elevation of something like that.
There's certainly a worship element going on.
Wait, so we certainly are an exploratory species, and just as when I was a kid, you get a mouse or a gerbil as a pet, you put it into a cage, it's going to explore. So mammals are many of them are very explorative. Human children are too. Is that what I'm sorry, you're saying this is what religion is somehow related to our exploratory instincts? What do you mean?
Yes, that it's a manifestation of our attempt to abstract out what the essential element of that is. So, for example,
this is where I was commenting on rationality rules. So, if and this is a degree to which Adam Friended is right. Jordan's whole project is it's Tower of Babel project. He's trying to construct from below a device in order to see, as it were, from heaven. If the clouds of secularity block you from the stars, tradition is about the best you've got. That together with instinct. And tradition is better than just mere instinct, because tradition is the accumulation of generation upon generation upon generation of instinct. I mean, when his approach to the Bible, every time he says, now again, he just hovers on that line and says, I'm speaking psychologically, because again, he's deeply modernist, and to transgress the line in public would be a transgression. He would no longer be playing a particular role in the public space, in the modernist sphere. Okay, but he keeps pointing above it and saying, God only knows, but that's his box, that's his line. And when he's talking psychologically, and he's when talking to someone like Jonathan Haidt, he wants to say, how far can we progress? How high can we build this tower?
Christianity, I think the faculty that's elevated to the highest degree is logos. And of course, that's translated into logic by the Greeks.
I'm not sure he has that right.
But that isn't exactly all it means. It means more like exploratory, communicative endeavor, but also
I think if you bring in Ian McGilchrist, it's much more a sense of capturing the ineffable that is behind the universe. It's right on the cusp here. It's bringing heaven to earth.
So with a tremendous emphasis on the truth. And I traced that development back, for example, into Egypt and into Mesopotamia. And the Egyptians worshipped the eye, Horus's eye. And that's the attentive eye. It's not rationality precisely. It's the ability to see what's in front of you. It's the opposite of willful blindness. And the Egyptians characterized it as such because the god of Egyptian attention, Horus, was the antidote to Osiris. And Osiris was the blindness of the state. He was the state and the blindness of the state. The Egyptians had that all figured out. And in Mesopotamia...
Because, again, the state, what is the state? Well, see, and when we say state, it's sort of an anachronism, because why is Pharaoh a god? Well, he's at the top of the hierarchy. And he's functioning in the office within the body of Egypt, and I'll bring in a Christian anachronism. He's functioning in office as the head of the body of Egypt.
The highest god, Marduk, he had eyes all the way around his head, and he spoke magic words, and he was the victor of a battle between a whole sequence of gods, competition between gods, that was likely the abstracted result of competition between tribes and their own local religions, because monotheism seemed to emerge like that. Imagine all these tribes with their...
Again, evolutionary monotheism versus revolutionary monotheism.
Local gods. They come together. When they come together, the gods fight, so to speak. And then over some immense period of time, they arrange themselves into something approximating a hierarchy. And whatever is the ultimate principle that the cultures, assuming they didn't destroy each other, derived, starts to take place. So you see, each of these local gods is an element of an ideal. And as they struggle across time, the ideals arrange themselves according to whatever principle generates ideals. And something at
Don't let that slip by.
according to whatever principle generates ideals.
According to whatever principle generates ideals, principality.
And something emerges at the top. The question is, what is it that always emerges at the top?
And of course, because he's in public, in a modern way, building a Tower of Babel, something emerges at the top. But you might as well ask, well, all along the way, you have things that are coming from the top down. The little boy comes to the stadium, now in Las Vegas, no longer the Oakland Coliseum, and becomes a part of Raider Nation. He is initiated into Raider Nation when he goes to the game with he or she, girls in the Raider Nation too, goes to the game with their parents.
There's a pattern, and it's the thing that we imitate. That's the crucial thing.
Wait, I'm sorry. What emerges out of the top? Give me an example.
The ideal. Well, I can give you an idea. I'll give you an example, okay? You tell me what you think about this, because it's expressed in all sorts of ways, because it can't be articulated, not fully. Okay, so
it can't be articulated. It can be instantiated in a more concrete way than the articulation.
You see Byzantine cathedrals. The dome is the sky. Okay, the cathedral's a cross.
Right.
The center of the cross is the central point of being. Okay. You look up at the sky, and there's a picture of Christ as Pantocrator, as creator of the world. Okay, what's the idea? And he's in gold. There's a halo. The halo is like the sun, and gold is a noble metal, right? It's pure and incorruptible. So that ties into that disgust issue that you've made so much of. Right. The logos idea is the idea that truthful speech brings about the best kind of reality. It's something like that. And so that's elevated. So you think, well, look, we imitate. We imitate the gist. Well, what is the gist extracted out over thousands of years? See, when I look at...
And that's how you can build your tower. That's how you can do your dead reckoning using holy books and practices and beliefs. To go back to my Vervaeke Bishop Barron video. And that's how you can navigate without the stars.
Religion extracted out over thousands of years. See, when I look at religion from a purely psychological perspective, let's say, and think about our continued discussion about what constitutes the human ideal, it's something personified. It has to be, because we can't imitate it otherwise.
It has to be personified. This is why you have saints. And in fact, you can try to articulate it, but you can never, because again, you look at these compression engines. Stories are incredible compression engines, but in some ways, movies where we see stories instantiated in a little bit more real way. I was having a conversation about the theater, real theater with a stage and actors on the stage versus cinema. And, there are give and take in those two realms, but this is all the instantiation, and there's so much packed into these images, into the art, that we use words and words surround them, but there are all these various different compression engines that we use.
That's the problem with abstract ideals as motivating. They're not personified. Even when Stephen talked about the civil rights movement, he had to mention John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, right? He had to bring the personality into it.
Yeah.
So you think, as we've organized our religions across time, as we've
In fact, if you just try to articulate the civil rights movement in abstract, in words, well, you can point to it. But in some ways, part of where we're sort of getting into trouble is we're trying to keep it in words, and we're looking at each other saying, you're no MLK Jr. And in fact, when he was assassinated, of course, Jesse Jackson was supposed to be the heir apparent. Didn't really turn out that way. Now, if Dr. King hadn't been assassinated, it's hard to know what his legacy would have been, because obviously when you lose your life in the midst of a movement, you, in some ways, ascend into the heavens, or at least onto the Washington Mall within stone.
Aggregated in,
Yeah.
and Martin Luther King, right? He had to bring the personality into it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you think, as we've organized our religions across time, as we've aggregated into groups and attempted to construct a monotheism, we're trying to figure out what principle should be elevated to the highest state.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're taking a very different approach to religion. I am a social functionalist.
And he's a social functionist. I mean, this part is really great, because now we're going to sort of see two different sides, and two is better than one. So he's a social functionalist.
Start by saying, what's a social functionalist? I start by saying, what's the social function of this?
So the social function, how does this group us?
I don't think humans are very motivated to find the truth. Now,
what's really interesting, if you go earlier in this video about right and wrong versus true and false, now that's key, because part of what he leans on Pinker is, you're not really dealing with human beings here. I don't know what abstract being you think you're talking to, but human beings are motivated by all of this stuff.
This is my particular view. There's a saying attributed to Robert Zients, a great social psychologist, that cognitive psychology is social psychology with all the interesting variables set to zero.
That's brilliant. Got to hear that again.
A great social psychologist, that cognitive psychology is social psychology with all the interesting variables set to zero.
Now, there exactly is the scientific method, right? We reduce the variables, try to find the relevance realization to achieve the outcome. The problem you have with that is you have to bring it back to the real world, in which, well, how about if we reduce these variables, set all those things to zero, and see what happens here? Because in real life, none of the knobs are set to zero. So that's brilliant saying.
So a lot of people try to use psychology to explain, how people are trying to optimize their information processing. Sure, we do that if we're trying to bet on the stock market, or if we're trying to get from here to there. But even then, we do all sorts of irrational things.
Isn't that kind of what we're doing with this video? With this conversation? With all of these conversations?
People try to use psychology to explain, how people are trying to optimize their information processing. Sure, we do that if we're trying
to optimize our information processing. Oh, we're doing that in a lot of our videos, aren't we? That's why we get all excited with science-y things.
Bet on the stock market, or if we're trying to get from here to there. But even then, we do all sorts of irrational things. Once you bring in the social fact.
Now, are instincts irrational? Are they irrational? What's the relationship between reason and instinct?
Factor. Sure, we do that if we're trying to bet on the stock market, or if we're trying to get from here to there. But even then, we do all sorts of irrational things. Once you bring in the social factors, those tend, in my mind, to overwhelm any sort of truth seeking.
What he said right there.
And but even then, we do all sorts of irrational things. Once you bring in the social factors, those tend, in my mind, to overwhelm any sort of truth seeking. And once you bring in religious thinking.
Now, I'd really love to hear how he defines religious thinking. What do you mean by religious thinking?
Any sort of truth seeking. And once you bring in religious thinking, where so much is done that is so evidently counter to truth.
Right there, you can see a big world of difference between Haidt and Peterson. Haidt, in a sense, has some of what we talked about with cosmic skeptics. Well, religion is something that's contrary to reason. Bishop Barron says, well, not at all. But what's going on? And Peterson would basically say, no, what you don't understand is religion is the accumulation of truth socially in the gist of the abstract pulled away. Now, of course, Brett Weinstein will say, well, we have to do a little bit of fact-checking on this, and I don't disagree with that because, again, in my video yesterday, I talked about the fact, what is the Enlightenment? So you've got the upper and lower register. And the Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation, these things were attempts to sort of recalibrate the story verse with the physical verse. And we got very excited about the physical verse because of the technological power that this kind of process was unleashing for us and the kinds of ways that we could get some of the things we wanted from ourselves and from each other and from the world. Now, modernity is about spent, because in a sense, the physical thing is sort of spent. And so now we're having to recalibrate it with the story verse. And that's exactly what we're doing in this conversation. Now, Jonathan Haidt has been cutting with a pretty powerful saw here. Now think about this, how this saw works with respect to what we're doing right here and right now.
This is my particular view. There's a saying attributed to Robert Zients, a great social psychologist, that cognitive psychology is social psychology with all the interesting variables set to 0. So a lot of people try to use psychology to explain, how people are trying to optimize their information processing.
So social psychology trumps this.
Sure, we do that if we're trying to bet on the stock market or if we're trying to get from here to there.
Little things. Your money, your physical safety, small things.
But even then, we do all sorts of irrational things. Once you bring in the social factors, those tend, in my mind, to overwhelm any sort of truth-seeking.
Does that overwhelm the truth-seeking that we're doing right now in this conversation? Am I just making this video for views? Are these two just making these videos for reputation? And think about the power of that saw and the power of that statement and apply it to me. See, modernity sort of pulls us up and says, I sit above the world as God and I see things as they are. And no, you can't do that. All this thinking is then subject to that critique too. Are the words coming out of my mouth merely a social game that I'm playing? Or do they actually connect up to anything?
And once you bring in religious thinking, where
that's really out of bounds.
So much is done that is so evidently counter to truth. And
there's no religious behavior going on in this little video conversation. No, we're up above it all. I don't think we are.
Many people point out, well, the point of believing something hard to believe is a demonstration of your commitment.
Yeah, I've read that. I don't buy that argument.
Yeah, I don't
think
know
it's weak.
Yeah, I don't know what to think about that particular argument.
Well,
and that, in fact, was an argument that Barron and Cosmic Skeptic were going at, this whole business about faith.
Okay, let me ask you this. So if I said I believed in you, what would that mean?
We're in some ways back in the other unbelievable video with Bishop Barron and Cosmic Skeptic, because we're getting at the question of faith.
Well, pragmatically, it means you support me, you're there for me, you think I'm on the right track.
I have faith in you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
So what that would mean, I think, it would mean that I, of your own accord, I would expect you to do the right thing. And I would rely on that and defend you.
And the you that I'm dealing with is not simply a function of your group. You might have to resist your group. Your group is certainly a factor. But I see you as an agent. I see you as a person. And that's how I'm relating to you with this faith. And I have skin in the game. In fact, literal skin in the game.
And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because that's one of the ways that people use the idea of belief. Right? It isn't, we have this idea that to express a religious belief is to express accordance with a set of facts, like scientific facts, but that is how it's seen. Yeah. No. You talked about ancestor worship. Mm-hmm. Okay. We believe in something like the central animating spirit of mankind.
At that point, Haidt is probably like, I don't know if I wanted to be in this conversation. The central animating what of mankind? Aren't we just working out our... See, right there, Adam. What on earth does Jordan mean by that sentence? The central animating spirit of mankind. We use that, we just kind of throw it out. And we think we're being poetic or artistic or something like that. But I'd say Jordan would say, I'm continuing to speak as a psychologist, as a modernist.
We believe in something like the central animating spirit of mankind. That's the gist that we're all imitating.
So we're abstracting that from everything and asking, what is this animating spirit that is not just animating me and you in this conversation, but is animating even history itself in all of its immensity and combinatorial explosiveness?
And that's what unites us. We're united around that ideal. And you see that expressed in the places that you described already. When you're playing with a band, that's a remark. I'd love to be able to do that. I can't do that, but I see people doing it. You can get a sense of that in the audience.
Now, if you believe in the resurrection, Jordan, you can have hope for something like that, because our little lives right here and right now, we don't have enough time. We don't have enough reach. We don't have enough capacity to play in a band, to dunk, to on and on and on and on and on. If you believe in the resurrection, you have that hope. Now, call me crazy, call me religious, call me unscientific, but nothing in this little material world says I ought not believe in such a thing. Oh, you might say, no, that's pride. I'd say you're already in the upper register, buddy. And once you're in the upper register, you're in my territory.
That I can't do that, but I see people doing it. You can get a sense of that in the audience.
Yeah,
you're united around something transcendent. It seems, and you're all imitating, right? Because you've all got the beat. You're all imitating the music.
Well, I would just say you're in. It's not that you're imitating per se. It's that you are moving as one.
So now he wants to say, well, this isn't really imitation. I don't know. Why do people watch documentaries about Woodstock? And why do sacred things emerge in our world? And why do... The most amazing part of the earlier video was when Steven Pinker referenced John Lennon in a religious way. Well, maybe I can find it. I just don't want to lose my place here. I'm at 129.49. So here Pinker's kind of on the defensive that his rationality doesn't really get anybody's blood moving, and it's basically going to fail in terms of real human beings instead of the things he's looking down on from his modernist monarchical vision.
Engage people without the trappings of religion or pseudo-religion? Can you engender a problem still?
We want to engage people without the religions, without the trappings of religion or pseudo-religion. And our examples of engaging people without the trappings of religion and pseudo-religion are...
mindset as opposed to a struggle mindset.
That's right.
And before we write people off and saying no, they can't, no one likes solving problems, it's too boring, it doesn't get the heart pounding, they've got to wear colored shirts, they've got to salute something, they've got to bow down. We
don't need totalitarianism or religion or any of those kinds of things.
We did eliminate smallpox. We've drastically reduced the amount of warfare, partly because of John and Yoko and Peter, Paul and Mary, but also...
Wait. I thought we weren't going to do this without religious trappings or things like religion, but we're going to use John Lennon and Yoko Ono and Peter, Paul and Mary. Those aren't religious. Oh no, was I not recording?
You support me. You're there
So I hate it when I do that.
for me. You think I'm on the right track.
I have faith in you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
So what that would mean, I think, and it would mean that of your own accord, I would expect you to do the right thing, and I would rely on that and defend you. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because that's one of the ways that people use the idea of belief. Right? It isn't, we have this idea that to express a religious belief is to express accordance with a set of facts, like scientific facts, but that isn't how it's seen. Yeah. No.
It's not facts, but it's not apart from facts. Again, go back to the Bishop Barron video I just made before.
You talked about ancestor worship. Okay. We believe in something like the central animating spirit of mankind.
Okay. And what does he mean by believe there? We lean into it. We act as if there's a central animating spirit of mankind. We say it all the time, and people say it all the time in public. I don't know why Jordan gets so, speaking psychologically, that's just his indoctrination into the academy, but
that's the gist that we're all imitating.
In other words, there's something that we're looking for. What's interesting about this video is you go all the way to the beginning of it. Gosh, I had 20 minutes of material that I wasn't recording. I was talking like an idiot to no one in my office. But now you'll just have more stuff that I just thought of now, and what I had before is lost. And I thought it was good too. This entire video starts out with a little clip of Steven Pinker talking about, in a sense, his main point, which is, well, how do we operate in the world? Well, we have to operate in the world by selecting things. Well, how do we select things? And what's interesting about the earlier part of this video is there's some different sections, and when you're listening, this is partly because of consciousness, when you're listening to something, oh, that's the most important thing. Oh, that's the most important thing. Well, that's the most important thing. And so what you're going to have to do is abstract from all of this stuff the gist. So let's hear Steven Pinker talking about the ways that I'll let him play it, then I'll make my comment.
Your understanding of the world on data rather than journalism.
On data rather than journalism. What is journalism? Well, it's an accumulated, collected, presented, as journalists would say, it's data just run through our relevance realization because the New York Times decides what's important. Now, we want to do this on data, rather, what he probably should say is rather than crisis mode. Well, why are we so crisis oriented? Well, it's because you got all these evolutionary thinkers say, well, it's because we evolved to face crises, and when we're dumb, fat, and happy, we're dumb, fat, and happy, and we stay on the couch. But when there's a crisis, we get off the couch. But now Pinker wants to say, well, we need to pace it on data rather than journalism. It's like, whoa, if I were a journalist, I'd be saying, wait a minute, I'm accumulating the data and bringing it to you. Why? Because of combinatorial explosiveness. There's way too much in the world, and you just don't, Steven Pinker, you're gunning for my job. That's basically what he's saying here.
The problem with journalism being that it is a highly non-random sample of the worst things that have happened in any given period.
So we're supposed to construct our worldview on random data? It's a big world. There's a lot of data. Oh, look, a lens cap. I'll construct my world on this random data. Oh, look, it's my old trackball that stopped working. I'll construct this world on my random data. There's a snow job going on here.
It is an availability machine in the sense of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman's availability heuristic, namely our sense of risk and danger and prevalence is driven by anecdotes and images and narratives that are available in memory. Whereas since a lot of good things are either things that don't happen, like a country at peace.
And these are all good points, but You're kind of fluffing me up here.
Or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists, which almost by definition are not news, or are things that build up incrementally, a few percentage points a year, and then compound, like the decline of extreme poverty. We can be unaware, we can be out to lunch about what's happening in the world if we base our view on the news. If instead we base our view on data, then not only do we see that...
Data? Isn't the news data? You know, when you're sitting down with somebody as a pastor and you start asking them some uncomfortable questions and they start reacting, and then a little pastoral trick, psychologists use this too. It's just data. What do you mean it's just data? My wife slept with another man. It's just data. Well, is it just data? Well, what is just data?
Many, although not all things, have gotten better, not linearly, not without setbacks and reversals, but in general, a lot better.
And we just threw better and worse in.
And it also, paradoxically, because as I've also cheekily put it, progressives hate progress. But the best possible case for progress, that is for striving for more progress in the future, for being a true progressive, is, again, not to have some kind of foolish hope, but to look at the fact that progress has taken place in the past. And that means
you don't look without being a looker. All right, why did I play that little clip?
We believe in something like the central animating spirit of mankind.
You have to somehow collect everything. There's just data, but there's too much data. Watch Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. There's just way too much data. So what do you do with data? You get a gist, and you're not going to just have a gist in terms of static things. You're going to have a gist in terms of process and movement and where things are going. And yeah, sure, the journalism, depending on what you feed off of, it's going to recalibrate and shape you. And Steven Pinker's point is an excellent point that, well, we'll look at static things, not just moving things, but how do we sort of boil all this down into this monofocal field of consciousness and get a sense of what I need to do today, taking as much data as I can manage into my world? Well, this is how we do it.
That's the gist that we're all imitating. And that's what unites us. We're united around that ideal.
And that's a deeply religious thing. That's, in fact, what religion tries to do, is take the whole world and turn it into a gist. Did we get stuff wrong? Oh, of course, fabulously. But everyone's doing it.
And you see that expressed in the places that you described already. When you're playing with a band, that's a remark. I'd love to be able to do that. I can't do that, but I see people doing it.
And in the previous version of this, I told Jordan, in the resurrection, you can play in a band, because this world is too small a canvas for your soul. And we all know this. And you might say, Vanderklay, you in the resurrection, you're giving them false hope. Really? How do you know? And in fact, if the materialists are right, so what if I believe in the resurrection? Does it make me a better neighbor? Does it afford me the fortitude to work in a forgotten little corner in the world and pour out my life for people who interrupt conversations, like the conversation that'll come out after this one, where I keep getting interrupted by homeless people? But that's what the resurrection offers, so that I don't have to be a hedonist and run around trying to collect all the good feels of this world, play in a band, do all the hedonistic things. There's a gist that I'm working off of that brings me to sacrifice for my children, sacrifice for my neighbor, and love one another.
You can get a sense of that in the audience.
Yeah,
you're united around something transcendent.
And that's all data.
It seems, and you're all imitating, right? Because you've all got the beat.
You're imitating the gist. You're imitating the ideal. You're imitating, and we want to imitate it.
You're all imitating the music.
Well, I would just say you're insignificant. It's not that you're imitating per se. It's that you are moving as one.
And I would think what Haidt does right there is actually reinforce Jordan's point. It's not, we don't just go, I feel the need of imitating today. I'm going to go to a place and imitate. Well, actually, if you do that on the street, you're going to annoy somebody. Freddie just called me today, was complaining he's living in a new place and this dude keeps following him. And if the dude not only followed him but imitated him, Freddie'd be royally ticked. It's not that you go and you decide to prioritize the people you want to imitate because you have a vision for something that's better.
So you're imitating the music, though. As well as moving at one, you're imitating. Well, you are from a Piagetian perspective because you're matching your body to the rhythms, right? So you're.
In other words, the spirit is coming into you, and it's exactly the word. What is the spirit? The spirit moves. It's like it's moving the trees. It's the spirit comes into you and it moves your body. When I worked in the Dominican Republic, if you wanted to go to a Haitian or a Dominican witch to have something done in your neighborhood, you would go and you'd pay him, you'd bring him some rum, you'd bring him a cigar, and the spirit doesn't get a chance to have physicality, so the spirit comes down, and maybe, if you give the spirit, you pay the witch pays the spirit tells you, well, this is where you buried your little sum of money that you decided to protect from your neighbors who are going to steal from you. That's exactly the word we use. It's the spirit.
So the mimicry is embodied. And that's what unites you. So you could say you're united by the spirit of music. That's fine. But I think it does tap into that imitative capacity because everyone does move as one.
Yeah, I would agree. Whether, I don't know enough about mirror neurons to say whether those, I don't know what the current state of research is on mirror neurons, but we certainly have this ability to match each other's movements. And that is part of imitation. And that does get us in sync.
We so sterilized it. John, would you take me dancing? I'm not sure the state of mirror neurons, but we certainly have the ability to match music with our bodies, and the two of us could stand outside. He would never talk this way. He'd get hit, probably.
And some people say this is why you should go for a walk if you're working out a conflict or a problem or you're negotiating, because physically moving in sync with the person tends to promote more agreement.
And this is always sort of the evolutionary psychology trick. Oh, I want to have agreement with, Joe Biden and the Chinese should go on a walk together and, figure out the world better. Well, do you want to be in sync with them? How about rationality? Well, I'm going to rationally employ all of these little evolutionary tricks to get what I want. Well, why do you want what you want?
I'd like to see that validated. I'm not positive that's a finding that holds up, but that makes a lot of sense to me. So I think we're both focusing on different aspects of the religious experience, and I'm coming in as a social psychologist looking at its social effects, and you're coming up as a clinical psychologist.
But you're also not writing it off as like a superstitious equivalent to rationality. Like
you're not a celebrity atheist.
You're trying to tie it to something that's deeper.
We evolved to be religious. This is
so that's
part of our nature.
So, but does that tell us anything about what we really want to know? Well, what do we really want to know? Well, is this all there is? When a tragedy happens and lives are lost, is it just tragic? Go back to Cosmic Skeptic, and he's leveraging all that pathos, but then when it's turned on him and say, but that's no different from the instincts in the rats, right? It just means more to us because we're not a rat. You're going to have a meaning crisis.
So that's the first issue is, okay, so you think that's a reasonable proposition. Mm-hmm. All right, so then the question is, what exactly does that signify? So let me try run this.
Okay, signify. Is it connected to something more?
Something else by you.
Okay.
You're interested in processes of natural selection. Now, so I made the proposition a little earlier that we are doing something like collective imitation of the ancestral spirit. That's what ancestor worship is. It unites a culture, something like that. You reflect your father, he reflected his father, etc., all the way back.
And again, if you go back to that piece, they're called grandfathers, but they're not exactly grandfathers. It's sort of vague what the Khmer are thinking about.
And the only way that we can be in agreement about something is if we share a lot of our presuppositions.
So the Khmer, well, they'll share, and now this will go big.
I mean, we can differ to some degree, but we have to have a shared personality to comprehend one another. E.O. Wilson said, if we could talk to ants, we wouldn't have anything interesting to say to them.
Yeah,
the ants would be completely bored by us.
Right. That's
right. So,
until we squashed them.
Our similarities and our differences make communication possible, but the similarity is something like, well, it's our participation in our shared culture, even our shared language.
Yeah, I don't know. I think if you are on a team with someone, if you're on a boat that almost capsizes and you and 7 other passengers, you don't speak any languages in common, but yet you struggle together.
Yeah, you can have some similarity and sharedness over that, but it doesn't scale like all of these narratives. For example, the United States is it's credo nationalism. It's all around a shared story and shared symbols and shared beliefs, and that's how you really scale. But you're not going to have that many people on the boat in charge.
You'll be friendly forever, or especially if you do sort of speak each other's language, you can communicate a little. So again,
that's okay. I'm not trying to localize it to a specific subculture.
Okay. Well.
Okay. Well,
I just meant I'm not sure we need common beliefs in order to feel that we're part of one. I think we need.
You might not need them if you just want to save your boat. If you want to have a nation of 1 billion people, I bet you they'll come in handy.
To move together, face a common enemy together. I just don't put as much stock in belief.
What do you think unites us if we face a common enemy together? Then
I think we evolve.
We? What's the connection between us and our million-year-old ancestors? We clump them all together as we. Oh, we might not have a lot of shared beliefs, but we certainly clump them in with us. Well, why? Why do we do all this clumping?
To have the ability to go into team mode very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And teams can go to 1 billion.
Is why teams and the army and other places can do a really good job of suppressing racial animus, because race doesn't matter when you're on a team.
Right. Okay. So
away.
That's fine. That's fine. So let's take the example of a team. That's perfectly acceptable to me, because teams can be of any size, essentially.
Yeah.
I would say that there's a central, what would I say? The team has a personality, in a sense, that's fragmented and represented by each of the players on the team.
It's distributed and participated in both. The personality of the 1976 New York Yankees had Thurman Munson and Chris Chambliss, and Bucky Dent came a little later, I think. Willie Randolph and Roy White and Mickey Rivers and Lou Piniella. And it also had George Steinbrenner and Billy Martin and Reggie Jackson. And I mean, that's how these principalities are formed. In other words, we're not just recipients of spirits, we're also spiritual and creators of spirits, and we're going up and down, back and forth among the registers this way.
So there's a unity that the team consists of that's represented in each of the players.
And if you went to Yankee Stadium back in the day, this is the old Yankee Stadium, I haven't been to the new one. But, they had, big jerseys hanging up, and they had, Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Mickey Mantle. It's an entire thing, the spirit of the New York Yankees.
And that's what constitutes the team element of it.
Okay.
So when we talk about personality, it's hard to say exactly what we mean. We mean something like an animating spirit, a pattern of action, a pattern of perception, something like that.
And that's exactly how we treat each other. And in fact, it's all of this relational mechanisms that we use, again, back to Pascal, the spirit of finesse. That's how we deal with persons and personalities, embodied, distributed, and in fact, distributed over any way manifest in the world. Well, if you go to the New York Metropolitan, if you go to a museum in New York and you see those huge statues from Egypt, you get a sense of their personality right in the statue. It's very low resolution. There's a lot of projection going on, but the spirit is still there in it to a degree or not. Just like the spirit of the Yankees was in Yankee Stadium and the spirit of the Red Sox is in Fenway Park.
There's no reason to assume that can't be shared between people.
In fact, people pick up on that spirit. People will, a friend of mine, Eric Dirksen, who's been on my channel, he's a Boston Red Sox fan. Because he went to Gordon Conwell Seminary for a couple of years, and so he loves going to Fenway Park, as does Dave Lindner, and another colleague of mine in the cluster loves going to Fenway Park. So when all they have to do to go into Fenway Park is participate in the spirit of the Boston Red Sox.
And I think that's the kind of seizure that you're talking about when you see people collectively participate in something they regard as sacred.
Okay, that could be.
Okay, that seems reasonable.
Now remember, Peterson is building up from the bottom. He's building, in a sense, sort of a Tower of Babel, and he wants to get high enough to look down. But he's always, as a modernist, saying, I can only go so high, and publicly I'm not going to go any higher publicly.
The question would be then, what's the gist of that central uniting principle? The reason
Again, back to the whole thing. We want to, Steven Pinker's like, you need perspective on the whole thing. Look at data, not journalists. Wasn't the journalist data? He's certainly using the journalist as data. You want perspective on the whole thing. You want a frame that can see the entire world. So that's where this little handy word called God comes from.
I'm asking this in part. You'll appreciate this, I think. There's a claim, quite common at the moment, that the central animating principle of Western culture is power.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a spirit. It's a principality. And the other spirits are looking at it saying, why do you get top billing?
It's a popular claim.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
I encounter it every day.
Right. What's the appropriate counterclaim? That there is no central animating spirit, or that that's not it?
And now we see the poverty of modernity. You banish these spirits and, well, there's no spirit. It's maybe the poverty of modernity that leads to the postmodern critique. There's no spirit. So then other spirits sort of, it's the parable in the New Testaments that says, you clean out the house of all of the spirits and 7 more spirits come in worse than the first.
That I face this a lot. And I think the response is to say, sometimes power matters. And there are those who believe that everything is sexuality, and sometimes sexuality matters. And there are those who believe that everything is money, and sometimes money matters, and sometimes self-esteem.
So how do you know which is mattering when? Well, all of them have spirits, and it's the spirits that are working through people and struggling with each other for supremacy.
And sometimes pain, sometimes joy,
right.
and
That's
like
right.
sometimes jealousy. Right, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so
right.
that's
people whose first response to everything is power structures,
are possessed.
You kind of know what they think because it's
and you might know how they act too.
Because that's exactly what spirits do. They possess and they're animating.
Yeah. So if you think that anything, whether it be the Western tradition or college, is all about power, that's just sad.
Well, it's also
so what spirit could in fact dominate all spirits and give you the gist of the animating spirit throughout humanity?
Completely. I've thought this through, and then I thought about all the people that I've admired in my life who were successful.
And what things might they have?
And so those would be people that I'd like to imitate, or at least I respect. And that seems to be a reflection of something like, a low level of awe.
Awe and admiration. And what goes into the awe and admiration of these people?
They weren't
admiration.
They weren't driven by power.
They were driven by sacrifice. Sacrifice for the welfare of another. The welfare of the other at the expense of the one. If only there was a story that was at the heart of the civilization where someone, it would have to be an archetypal story, where someone who was ideal, perfect, gave his life for those who were not only imperfect, not only his family, not only those in his kinship groups, but all the way up to and including his enemies, and gave his life in a crime of his enemies against him, forgave them, and eventually would enfold them in to call them friends. Such a person we would call God, because that would then be an animating spirit of an entire civilization. And it would shape the buildings and the songs and the music and the ideal that we would look at and say, well, there's the ideal. That is the ideal man. Now, you might say, wow, such a story. I'd really want a civilization that would have a story like that. But if you said, well, but that's arbitrary. There's no moral difference, no value difference between a civilization that has that at the core of it and one, let's say, that has, I don't know, rape, kill, plunder, steal to get everything I want, my well-being at your expense. The difference between them is arbitrary. We don't believe that. We don't believe that for a minute. You might say, oh, but that's just the formation that we've been doing. Oh, okay. Part of Jordan Peterson's quest is he wants to say, is it just arbitrary or is it built into the world?
That's right.
They were driven by competence and generosity.
That's right. That's right. And there you go. And so this is actually one of the hallmarks of a religion is people are committed to something that's obviously not true on its face.
Not true on its face.
And the people who are really committed to this religion, that everything is power, this sort of Michel Foucault religion, they even interpret family life as being about power. That my relationships with my kids is primarily about my power. I mean, that's just bizarre.
And marriage.
That's yeah.
Why is it bizarre? Because how does he look at his relationship with his kids? They get his time. They get his money. They get his attention. He probably puts up little pictures of them in the home that to ancient people might even look like an altar. They get his worship. Well, why on earth would you worship your children? Well, you're not really worshiping them, but you certainly are sacrificing for them because in your mind, there's an idea, there's a spirit at work that says such a thing is in fact good because that's what the ideal father does for his children. And that's what the ideal mother does for her children. And this is in fact the ideal working its way through all around. And this other spirit, this other animating spirit, well, that's just bizarre. That makes no sense because that's not anywhere in line with the spirit that's already at work all around us. And this all we know.
That's right, because I'm a man and my wife's a woman. Therefore, I must be motivated to have power over my wife, and I must feel something in common with other men because we're all men. We're all trying to maintain the power structure. I mean, this is far wackier than saying there was this guy and he was killed and he came back to life 3 days later. I mean,
Why is it wackier? Why is it wackier? Well, it's wacky because, well, we as a group believe this. Well, why do we as a group believe this? Oh, it's simply an accident of history. Is it more right or more wrong? How could we know? Well, if it's really that arbitrary, why not love this one? Why not love this story? And, well, let's imagine that there's a God, and this God would send this message about these values, and because you can't just tell people this stuff because words have only this much utility. What you'd really have to do is go all the way down and act it out. And you have to act it out in such a dramatic and sacrificial way that it would deeply impress upon people. It would change the spiritual it would change the spiritual course of history. And, well, lots of people die for people. How would you know? How could you point out the archetypal instance? Why don't you get their attention by having them show up just the day after that mysterious empty tomb, and have them show up and say, why don't you give me a fish? Why don't you stick your fingers in the holes? Now, does this change you? Well, I don't know if it changes me. I'm a little uncertain about it. What if I give you my spirit? How is that spirit given? It's given through wind and through flame and through story, and it gets transmitted in buildings. And even if you don't know anything about it, you see its opposite and you say, that's bizarre. I don't love my children because I'm participating in the principality of power, and I somehow derive, some sick joy out of mastering these tiny little people that I brought into the world. Well, you've got biology fighting against you too. And well, I don't stay faithful to my wife and continue to give her anniversary gifts and go to that place and move my body strangely with her using those mirror neurons. And I don't do all of that because I'm participating in the patriarchy. And what I really want is control over this woman's body. You're really looking for control over arbitrary women's bodies? No, that's bizarre. There's another story that makes way more sense than that.
This is just a matter of faith. And so the fact that it is intruded so deeply into the academy now, again, not in most departments, but in some of the departments that you and I both know, this is the religion. Everything's about power.
Yeah, well, we don't seem to have been able to put forward a very good counterclaim.
Why not? Because that other story, well, we got to get that story out of here. Can't have that. Oh, we'll have this other. Is that an improvement?
But I think it's as we were talking about with Steve. The good counterclaim is something which you have to sort of reason through, and it's about process.
Will reason answer this question? Reason won't answer this question. Reason will say, well, I don't know. I'd kind of like to enslave my children. I'd kind of like to enslave women in general and make them my slaves. Reason doesn't tell you what is good. Reason helps you figure out how to get there. So it's funny because in the early part of the video, Haidt was sort of leaning against Pinker. Here at the end, he's sort of defaulting to him.
More than any particular person, and we need equal treatment in front of the law, and we need all these things, and it's not as inspiring.
Oh, yeah, but there's another problem with it too. It's not like I don't have sympathy for that viewpoint, and there's nothing wrong with a reasoned argument. But look, whatever's at the bottom of the woke movement is critical of the processes of reason themselves. Mm-hmm. Right.
Because everything is white supremacy.
Well, everything is up for grabs, at least.
Right.
So it's a radical critique of Enlightenment thinking. It's also an attempt to identify Enlightenment thinking specifically with Western European thinking, mm-hmm. which I think is a great mistake, but it doesn't matter. I don't think that it isn't obvious to me that those merely rational responses are going to do the trick.
You need something more powerful. You need a God. At the end of the, Infinity Wars, Thor comes down. You need a God. You need a God that's going to take care of this thing. You need a spirit that has taken the principalities and powers and led them in triumphal procession. That's what you need.
No, in general, not. But something that I've begun to think a lot about is the importance of specifying the institution or the domain before you say anything else. Mm-hmm. And so we can talk about, will a rational argument persuade people? And if we're talking about like on planet Earth, or just, out on the public square, your odds are not very good. And so the trick to having a good society is one in which there are domains within which people have a set of be it professional norms or norms about how we do things.
Your gods are showing.
And so the norms in a college seminar class should be very different and much more generous and much more about building on each other's arguments and
There's a spirit and an ideal about the university.
And critiques than it is on Twitter. And part of what's changed, part of why I keep saying the world is so different after 2012 than it was before 2009, is that social media knocked down all the walls between different domains.
There's another power that came into the room, another spirit that has come in, and it's swamping. Well, yeah, it's swamping the church too. I mean, I'm not gonna sit here and say that I have facile answers, but what I do have is trust. Now, I am out of time for today, but I will post this on, let's see, today is Tuesday. I'll post this on Wednesday. And let me know what you think. I don't know if I'll finish this up or not, but yeah, this is a worthwhile conversation that Jordan has done.
And now the norms of the norm.
Oops, am I going to stop or am I going to stop? Got to hit the right button. It's hitting the wrong button that got me in trouble before.